of my family.
Can I ask you to keep your voice up as much as possible?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, we'll talk over to the front side of it, please.
The world is now aware that my family and I were invited by the British Prime Minister David Cameron to 10 Downing Street earlier this week to hear his decision on the holding of an inquiry into the murder of my husband, Pat. Even now, days after the event, we still feel humiliated and insulted by the ordeal we were made to endure. Not only were my family and I forced to listen to the Prime Minister of Britain renege on a promise made by the British government, we had to hear him tell us over and over what it was that we really wanted, how we really wanted to achieve it, and what our ultimate response would be. It was clear within minutes that we had been lured to Downing Street under false pretences by a disreputable government led by a dishonourable man. My family and I have been humiliated publicly and misled privately. The Northern Ireland Secretary of State, Owen Paterson, has denied that the government misled my family. He claims that the reason we were brought to London was to allow the Prime Minister to apologise personally. I reject this explanation as untrue and self-serving. I intend to reveal the details of discussions with British government officials over the last year, which will show clearly and prove that my family and I were indeed misled. Lawyers for my family, including my 2 sons, attended meetings over the course of the last year with both the Secretary of State and his officials. Most of these meetings were private to facilitate open discussion. The process was part of a review by the government to determine whether a public inquiry remained in the public interest. The government was keen to know if we would participate in an inquiry, and if so, under what conditions. Our objection to the heart of the Inquiries Act 2005 is very well documented. We opposed the use of the restriction notices created by the Act because a government minister can impose these upon an inquiry at will. We had asked the previous government not to use them, but were told this was impossible. However, a recent case, the Bahamusa inquiry, created just such a precedent. Restriction notices were not deployed in Bahamusa. Instead, decisions about the restriction of evidence were left to the independent judge. We told the government that an inquiry operated along the same lines as Bahamusa would be something we could participate in, although it was made clear that the minister would make the final decision on an inquiry. The indications from government officials were very encouraging. At no time were we advised that an alternative to an inquiry was also under consideration. Lest there be any misunderstanding, we committed our position to writing in a submission delivered to the government. Copies of this document are available. As it makes clear, the focus of the discussions between our family and the government was the manner in which the inquiry might proceed. It was the government itself that brought the Bahamusa inquiry into the discussions as a model upon which progress could be built. A considerable amount of time was spent exploring how it could be utilised as a blueprint for Pat's case. At no stage was a review in the manner announced by the Prime Minister ever discussed. We were told the Secretary of State would make a decision. When we learned that the Prime Minister wished to meet with us in Downing Street, we assumed, as did many others, that the government was going to confirm its commitment to the promise of a public inquiry. Furthermore, in a recent telephone conversation between a senior NIO official and our lawyer, Peter Madden, we were told the Prime Minister was confident we would be happy with what was on offer. We could not bring ourselves to believe that we were being invited as guests to the Prime Minister's home just to be refused the public inquiry promised many years ago. The fact that David Cameron did so, and in such a public fashion, ranks as one of the most cruel and devastating experiences of my life. What Mr. Cameron has established is a review of the papers in this case. The person appointed, Sir Desmond de Silva, will simply read the statements collected by the Stevens investigation team. Although he will be permitted to speak with relevant persons, this will be done behind closed doors. My family will not be participating. We will not be permitted to participate. We will see nothing for ourselves, hear nothing for ourselves, and say nothing for ourselves. And if anyone refuses to speak with Mr. De Silva, he has absolutely no powers to compel them. My family and I have no confidence in this process. We cannot be expected to take the Prime Minister's words that it will be effective when he is reneging on a government commitment in order to establish it. His actions prove beyond doubt that the word of British Prime Minister is not to be trusted. The case of Pat Finucane shows that the British Prime Ministers no longer keep their promises. My family and I take great encouragement from the renewed support we have received this week, domestically and internationally. And Taoiseach Enda Kenny has already asked for an urgent meeting with the family next Monday. Members of the US Congress have criticised the decision publicly and made their feelings known to the US and British governments. Perhaps most telling of all, 2 former Northern Ireland Secretaries of State have disagreed with the Prime Minister and urged him to reconsider. They have called this review a mistake. It is much more than that. History will not look favourably upon the decision of Mr. Cameron to welsh on the promise that was made. My family does not believe that a public inquiry into Pat's murder would elevate his case above the death of others. We support the quest of any family for truth and justice. We believe that a public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane would be a force for good and not a long-running, open-ended waste of money. It would clear a lot of the very poisonous air that has been left behind. Most of all, we do believe that the British government should honour the promise they made. Thank you.
Can I just address the legal issues and a bit of the legal history here? Jim Gerling's covered what family's feelings about the meeting in Downing Street. I want to try and just briefly outline the history of the engagement with the NIO team, my own legal team, since 2005 when the Inquiries Act was published. And that's really all I want to deal with. There's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of to and fro, and there are a lot of meetings, there are a lot of correspondence, and I intend to publish this shortly. But to just be brief about it, in 2005 when the Inquiries Act and the Inquiries Bill actually published, we rejected it immediately because of the restriction on the publication and making public of documents and material during the course of the inquiry. And we rejected, which eventually became Section 9. The rest of the Act was something that most people would go with. Section 19, and there's only a part of Section 19 that the family objected to, and that was what they called in the legislation restriction notices. A restriction notice is a notice that can be served on the panel, on the inquiry panel, by a government minister, preventing him from making public any material, even if the panel wanted to publish that material. So I have to make it clear, this has been, I suppose, we've talked about this a number of times, it's an obscure enough topic, but the family were not objecting to the Inquiries Act, the family were not objecting to an inquiry under the Inquiries Act, the family were objecting to the part of Section 19, one small section. So in relation to that was the immediate response that we made to the publication of the legislation. There was a lull for a while and there were some to and fro, not much happening. But in April 2010, my legal team met with the NIO legal team in London at Blackstone Chambers, where we met with the NIO's QC at that time, and that was under the Labour government, under Tony Blair's government. Now, that discussion revolved around restriction notices that the government at that time were proposing to put together, and they were asking us for an input into the discussion about restriction notices. We attended the meeting, we had the discussion, we rejected the fact that if there were any restriction notices, we couldn't go along with it, because it hampered the independence of any panel would ever be appointed to hear an inquiry. So again, there was a lull right up until June 2010, when the new Secretary of State, Owen Patterson, wrote to me and asked me to that I arrange a meeting for the Finucane family with him to discuss the case, discuss Pat's case. And I arranged that. There was again some to and froing. We didn't get the meeting until November, when Owen Patterson met Geraldine and John. He had a discussion I think that was on the 8th of February, and then on the 5th of November, and on the 11th of November, he issued a statement, you may recall, in which he set out what he called were the terms that they were going to that the government would go forward with, asking for submissions within a 2-month period, and setting out that the government would then decide whether or not it would be in the public interest to have a public inquiry at all. Now, this sort of follows on, going back even before 2005 to Western Park, the commitments made at Western Park, and also commitments made to the United Nations by the British government, and commitments made to the European Committee of Ministers by the UK government in relation to that they were going to hold an Inquiries Act inquiry. These are commitments that still exist. Now, on the 11th of November, as I say, Mr. Patterson issued his statement. As a result of that statement, I then wrote to him to suggest that possibly my legal team could again meet the legal team that we met in London for further discussion about what was envisaged. And Mr. Patterson wrote back to say, no, that wasn't on, because there's a new government in. We're starting from scratch. We're going to take a different view, possibly, and that that legal team is defunct as such. But offered a meeting with a new legal team, a new NIO legal team, which actually involved some of the officials from the old legal team. But so that was offered, and we took him up on that. On the 20th of December, I had this phone call and discussion with the senior NIO official heading their legal team, and he said this. He said that he wants to talk about resolving the issue. This government wants to move it forward, not like the previous government. He wondered whether we could compromise on the Inquiries Act 2005. If the family are insisting on not going ahead under this act, then is it possible to hold an inquiry under some other basis, or even under a non-statutory basis? He said we'd welcome discussion about the family's duty principles and discussion about Section 19 generally. He'd been a meeting with, he mentions another official, and that would be set up. I told him that such a meeting would be useful, but that the 11th of January deadline, which was imposed, presented difficulties. And he said the Secretary of State wanted the deadline so that the issue didn't drag on like previously, but that the date was flexible in the sense that he could inform Parliament that some further time would be required if the family thought they wanted further time. So there was that discussion, and then after that there was a meeting on the 6th of January with the two legal teams. We met at Stormont House, and it was a lengthy meeting. And we discussed how we would go forward. I had said that an important indicator of an inquiry would be independence, and we talked about what sort of an inquiry it would be. There was a short discussion about the Bahamusa inquiry under the 2005 Act, under the Inquiries Act. There was a discussion about the non-statutory inquiry by Peter Gibson into torture allegations at Guantanamo Bay. And there was a general discussion about how we could move this forward and clear the logjam. Now, the logjam was part of Section 19. The logjam was restriction notice. And from the family's point of view, that's all that the family were concerned about. So, as a result of that meeting, we exchanged papers. We were asked to issue, we were asked to send a discussion paper setting out what we proposed would be our principles. So we set out a discussion paper in relation to the principles that we said would be minimum to ensure the proper investigation of circumstances surrounding Pat's murder. So this was a minimum discussion paper, minimum issues on the discussion paper. We said it had to be effective, had to be independent, it had to be public, it had to be accessible to the family, it had to be prompt. You know, and we're saying, well, this is 22 years later, it's not exactly prompt, but that was, we're sort of coming from the international legislation in relation to the Article 2, the European law in relation to these type of investigations, and that's where we got that from. And we told the government those were minimum.